So welcome, Professor Chen, and it's been the third time and actually you and me have a direct dialogue. And at the very beginning, we would like to start with who influenced you the most to develop your own design languages? Could you introduce us how you apply it into your projects?
Okay, thank you, Jessica. I've always thought that it's appropriate to learn from history and to learn from the best. Okay, so they had reimagined what future housing could be. All I could do is to distill what they have been thinking about. Corbusier, for example, thought of the house, the unit or the apartment as a machine for living. Mies van der Rohe utilized assemblage and precision, meaning he developed curtain wall to allow light to come through. And Frank Lloyd Wright sought to integrate nature into buildings through his organic architecture. So with those principles, over the years, we have had the chance to rethink what it means to design for the high density housing. And we've been lucky to have projects in different locations of different budgets to test those ideas. The concerns that we have are universal concerns of people living in an apartment that's true to everybody, no matter where you are. Light and air is required for wellness. Spatial plasticity, meaning think about living in a volume rather than a space only. And of course, integration with nature. Nature creates wellness. And you can see from this summary of these 10 projects, over a period of 20 years, there's been a consistency in the way of thinking about design and how we put buildings together. I start designing not just with plans. When a project comes with requirements, not just with plans, but to start to think about volumes. And all those diagrams show that I think about apartments volumetrically. So instead of just 2 dimension, spaces can have double height. It can have exterior space that are double height, and it opens up a flexibility of design. My first project given to me for a high-rise was in 1999. It was a 36-story building. And my second project, 3 years later in Malaysia, I really used that project to distill. It was a very important moment in my career to have this high-rise project. So I thought upon the idea that we were given small apartments to design, and I questioned why not a small apartment of 500 square feet or 50 square meters? Why can't it have a high living and dining space? And in order to create efficiency, I thought of the units as being able to stack, as in the diagram. I will not repeat too much about the diagram, but every project I introduce will have a diagram that would show the relationship. In 2002, the same opportunity of a site that has a view to 1 KLCC park, but instead of 2 dimensions, you see that the volume now is plan and section. And in the corner, you have the double-story living room. But what else is different is that these volumes now has a gap in between them. And the gap brings in light and air. The gap allows you to bring in nature, a piece of nature. So in most of these projects, even though they're high density, I try to think of it volumetrically to introduce nature to all the projects. So in this project in 2004, we have 94 apartments, each with their own private pool. So rethinking how amenities can be given privately to each unit. But besides amenities, I thought about the units as a series of houses or dwelling that I shifted to introduce these pools. But this is more than just pools. These are slots that bring in light and air. And the center of the building has an atrium that draws in the air upwards. Then another project in 2006. This time around, same thing, but every unit on a single floor has a double-story living dining room that is flipped alternatively. The idea here is to create a feeling of living on the ground, a feeling of living on a house. So even though it's high density, everybody gets to go outside and get to enjoy a piece of the pool, even though you're in the skyline. What creates the feeling of home is the high space and also the transitional space between inside and outside. On the ground, as in Corbusier's principles, buildings are raised. They are raised in order to bring nature right through the lobbies. Two other projects to illustrate connecting to nature. One is 21 Anguilla in Singapore, the other one is Savi Avasa in Jakarta. In this project in Singapore, besides fulfilling the brief of a large unit and a small unit, we thought of the units as a stack of 6 apartments. And then these 6 apartments can be configured to create these pockets of sky garden that are 6 stories tall. So now our common pool, our gym can be elevated, not necessarily on the ground, but we can bring nature up to the sky. And the way to do that is to think of design in a volumetric sense. On the ground, nature is always brought in. We want to blur away the distinction between indoors and outdoors. In Jakarta, we were given a beautiful site in the park, Taman Wangsa Park, and we thought that these apartments should have a porch that wraps around. Then everybody can step out, and it also protects from the tropical rainstorm that's often found in Jakarta. So you see the brown area is a continuous porch that has been given shade and privacy through these fins, and it creates a sense of living outdoors while being protected. And on the ground floor, the same concept holds true. These are sensitive responses to climate in tropical architecture. So yes.
We could actually see that light, air, space, and connecting with nature are all the key approaches which make your design standing out. But we will also notice that the projects you just shown, actually, it's based on where you're based, like Singapore, Malaysia. So could your ideas can be transformed in cities at different regions of the world, like China or other colder weather part of the world?
Yeah, I believe in the potential of universal architecture. I believe that those ideas can be translated. We have had the opportunity to design in Japan, in China, in the US, and other temperate climates. For example, in 2016, this project in Tokyo, we sought to bring the idea of the park. The master plan has this green park, and we wanted to bring the green park upwards. So again, we conceptualized the brief in a volumetric sense, and we're able to create these slots. These slots allow us to bring plants up vertically. So every unit gets to enjoy this greenery. And on the upper level, the pool is heated and is climatized indoors. In the summer, panels can be opened up to allow light and air to come through. We have a project in China too, in Zhengzhou, which is the Kangqiao project. And in this project, it's the only project that we actually get to try this volumetric approach, because after that, the planning regulations change and the double height space created more floor areas. We brought in the idea of multi-generational living, where multi-families of different generations can live together. You can see in our section, the units are all interlocking. So it's a bit more complex, but it creates very interesting mix of spaces. This is the actual show flat. So then we tested this concept again to a country that has even more colder winters. This is in New York City, Park Lane. Facing Central Park, this is a competition where we are shortlisted to be the last 3 architects. Unfortunately, it's not going to be built. They shelved the project. But this is the genre of the pencil tower, which is becoming very common in New York. But when a project is in such a cold climate, we apply the same principles, but we need to introduce another layer. In this case, between the outside balcony and inside, we created something called a solarium or a sunroom. A sunroom is a space where it collects heat from the southern exposure, and we are able to then introduce the same concept because we have created a zone that's milder. And in the summer months, we can introduce again some of the ideas of the water feature and the pool. And 2012, after several attempts on not having my New York projects built, I chanced on this opportunity of a site. And I told myself, if I could become the developer, I can commission myself, and perhaps I could create a vision that's very pure that I've been trying to do for many years. And the difference about this site is that it's not a standalone site with landscape. It fits into a dense urban environment, located next to the High Line and also next to the Hudson Yards. New York planning regulations are very strict, and you have to fit all the units into a prescribed volume. But here I've still tested the idea of the sky pools and the interlocking units. You can see that within this constrained volume, I'm still able to carve 8 different types of volumes like a puzzle and put it together. And there is a functionality to all these pools also. If you look at it, the building has 2 exposures. It has a southern exposure and a northern exposure, but the center is dark. So the slot created for the sky pool actually bring in air and light deep into the building. This is the living room. It has a fireplace and has a heated pool. It comes fully fitted out. You can see that that sky pool actually brings light deep into the middle of the building as well. So being the designer and developer, we get to actually create a very pure vision and be able to test this vision in a city like Manhattan. So I'm convinced that there is a universality to a good language of architecture, one that's based on humanity rather than just formal expression, one that's based on the human spirit. And even in this project, we created a lot of terraces so you can go outside and appreciate the skyline. So that kind of summarizes, perhaps I answered the question that I think is transportable to different countries.
So to respond into the surrounding area and to develop your design language and apply it into the universe as a standard rule is quite important. And in Soori Highland project, you are not only the architect, but also developer. And we have lots of developers invited as audience today. And what did you bring to the Soori Highland with the developer's role that make it so successful? Could you share with us?
I think for every project to work, first of all, I become much more empathetic with the issues of development. I understand development is complex. I'm more empathetic of the developer because besides design, there's finance, there's market, there's a lot of other issues. There's authorities, there's timing.
And your name and design are very much linked with luxury residential projects. Have you ever encountered with the situation with lower budget, but still could apply your design philosophy?
I have, in fact, and in 2006, I jumped at the opportunity when the Singapore government asked me to reconceptualize the housing development of Singapore, which is a social housing. As you know, 80% of Singaporeans live in subsidized social housing, and that includes young professionals. When Singapore first became independent, houses were built very quickly, very densely, and as such, you have a lot of prototypical HDB that looks like this, with surface car park lots where the land itself may not be well utilized. So this is a chance for me to see what I can rethink and redo. The other concerns about social housing is that it's not necessarily like private housing, which is market driven, where you have to have a lot of features to sell. In social housing, you have to start by thinking about people and how people live. Things like laundry. Do you create a space for them to have laundry? How do people use the space? When you have a common space, people use it to socialize. It's unprogrammed. People use it at weddings, and people use it at funerals. And sometimes you have weddings and funerals next to each other. And they adapt it to have childcare and elderly care. So I realized that the program that we were given, we could reinterpret it to create a new concept. So concept of housing in a park, connectivity to surroundings, and multi-generational living, which is a very important concept. This one is about the site. The site looks onto ecological green space. The site is also connected by a linear park, which is an old canal. So when we have this site, I thought that this site should be a continuation of nature. Nature should not be interrupted. So conceptually, nature is brought up over the car park and into the sky terrace. So the car park, rather than being on the surface, is tucked under the building, and the entire car park becomes a green hill. We're going to landscape it to make it look like a hill. And I thought, if you had to walk to your car, why do you have to walk inside the car park? Why can't you walk on the outside among the landscape? And on the way to the car park, we have a communal roof that is on the top of the podium. And in this podium alone, we have these air wells where plants actually go into the car park. So you don't need to have exhaust, and you don't need to have ventilation. It's a very ecological solution. So even the car park is rethought, and it's pleasant. And the fire refuge floors are now landscaped, and we call these sky gardens. There are yoga classes, there's martial art classes. It becomes an amenity. And then we thought about all those activities that take place in the social housing. People do have weddings, they do have funerals. You can see that we have dedicated space for amphitheater and funeral. We combine elderly care with a child care center, a coffee shop, worship facilities, and gardens. So having this program is important, and separating them in a way that gives them privacy is important, all under one small plot. But the important part is the tower. How do you generate this tower? In Singapore, we have an aging population, and we have multi-generational living. It's already very common that two couples have to work to make income, and they usually drop their kids to their parents in the morning and pick them in the evening, have dinner together. So rather than drive, we conceptualized that they could live together. So the green is the elder studio for the grandparents. They have their own key with the elders facilities, and the standard unit is next to it. So as a result of that, we also taught how to build this cheaply. So we created this precast concrete construction and lifted up onto site and stacked. It's a clear expression of the unit to the brief. But more importantly, there's a stair that connects these two units and two doors. If two doors are both open, it becomes one unit. So rather than drive, they can just leave the children upstairs, lock the door, and go to work. And the government liked the idea very much and made it into a policy. If 3 families live together, there's subsidies to get a cheaper flat. And even considerations like the laundry and clothes drying, we've kept it up to the inside of the building where all the aircon units are located. So the hot air from the air conditioning helps to dry these clothes. We also push for sustainable development. The blue areas collects rainwater that drips down to irrigate all the landscape below. And when water reaches the ground, we have bioswales that filters the water to go back into a storage tank, and solar panels on the roof for the public areas. So these are integrations of many things, considerations of the way people live, program, and climate. So in a way, I think budget is not an issue, because in some ways I like this project because it's very honest and it's stripped down to the bare essentials. And what you see is what you get.
So we actually see that even with lower budget, people still could live a qualified life with concerns from design and architecture, like to connecting still the project with the nature, and even to consider the small details like laundry. And architects take the responsibility of building a better home environment. are you starting to explore and applying your practice into other typology, such as public space, so your design could benefit a larger base of end user?
Right. So the answer to that question is, really, does this methodology of design apply to public buildings and institutions? For example, in 2011, we won the competition for a design center. So when you start with a design center, you look at the environment, you look at what is given to you. In our case, we had to restore 3 conserved buildings from different periods. And its location is within the arts district. So we realized that on the top, you have the school, the art school, and the bottom, you have the library. So our site is located right in between. So the concept that I could think about to unify these 3 different buildings is to introduce 2 courtyards, an enclosed courtyard and an exterior courtyard, and to let these courtyards be open 24/7 to allow students to be able to pass through it. But it is a conservation project after all, and we have to restore the building. But when we restore the building, we made sure to separate the new and the old. And we explored how we could close the atrium. And our concept was really to use a folded plane, like origami, to create this skyline. And this idea is then carried through to other parts of the building. Here you see the overall space. And I want you to pay attention to the lower level. The lower level actually has doors that pivots. So when you open these pivoting doors, it can change the configuration of how space is used. And when you open these doors, the picture on your right shows beyond those doors, there are actually square cubes. And these square cubes can be pushed out to create exhibition pods. And the new addition beyond it, the studios, we lined it with warm wood to have that contrast. We have a chapel that has been converted into an auditorium. Here, we've used the same origami idea to create this folded ceiling to hide these different requirements. And because it is folded, it helps acoustically as well. And we have created a new staircase to connect to the auditorium. So where we introduced something new, we made it extremely modern. When we restore, we kept to the old features. Even the fire escape staircase becomes a lantern or a beacon in the building. We also won the Singapore Art Museum competition, which is a historical monument. It used to be an old school. And we are told that we had to introduce very large 2,000 square meter column-free space for contemporary art display. It was not easy to introduce such a big space within an old building without destroying the building. So what we did first was to look at the site again, and we realized the site is in the middle of the art district. What we do here becomes the heart of the art district. This is where the subways and students will come. It's more than a museum, it's also an educational center. So we looked at the old building and we took away buildings that were added through the years that's not true to the original design. And we switched the entrance. Instead of the entrance being from the front, we introduced the entrance on the side, on Queen Street. So we just wanted to contrast old building with this huge 2,000 square meter new addition. And the building across the street is an old school that will be turned into educational facilities. Here we introduced a 700 square meter auditorium and proposed a bridge to link the two. We also proposed to close the road to make it into a plaza as the subway stop is here. So this becomes the heart of the art precinct. So again, the generator of this concept is not necessarily what I spoke about for housing, where it's generated by unit type and market. This is generated by urban design and by civic functions. And once the idea is set, we go about thinking about how to design in a very simple way as a juxtaposition or contrast with the old building. This is the Auditorium Edition. And within the museum itself, we made sure that the old parts of the museum is celebrated. It's painted white. Any new addition is in stainless steel. And we could climate control this whole environment. without losing the feeling of it being an old building. This is the circulation to the annex building. It's been used also for informal keychains. And a special staircase to lead you to the very top of the 2,000 square foot sky gallery. Now in this sky gallery, you can see the historical dome. It's made out of 138 pieces of glass, each 13 meters tall. And they have two different colors. One is clear glass and one is bronze glass. And each of these glass is tilted a few degrees. So if you look at the glass panes, every pane is shifted. What this does is it reflects the dome. It deconstructs the dome. And it's a relationship of new and old, saying that we respect the dome, but we're also changing. It's a reference of the time. But the last project I want to talk about is, to me, interesting. It's never built. We entered a competition which we didn't win, but I thought that it's worth talking about because it is a project to commemorate the founding fathers of Singapore. Its founding father is history. And the site is actually in Bay East Garden in Marina Bay, in a park. And, you know, it's next to a subway and it's in a very prominent site. But the question becomes, how do you start a memorial in a place like Singapore where the founders of Singapore don't like to memorialize themselves in sculptures and statues? So it's not easy to start a project like that where you have to tell the story of the country and also make people feel emotionally drawn to it, to evoke a feeling of pride and sacrifice that came from these leaders. So what I've shown here actually was a section. Be able to appreciate this form. This form was derived from the idea of the rain tree. Rain tree is the national tree of Singapore. And in a way, if you look at the reflection, the form is a feat of engineering. It's very simple, but it's a symbol of rain tree. And one of the key quotes that I found was this: a society grows great when men plant trees whose shade in which they know they shall never sit in. The meaning is that people sacrifice for the future generation. And I thought that this is a very simple statement, and I'll plant rain trees all around this monument. It's a simple idea. And when you go to the lower level, you're able to appreciate the strength of the rain tree and come under its canopy. And you also know that for every tree of this size, there's foundations in its roots. The roots spread out beyond. And when you actually finish the tour of the history, you go into the middle. This is the memorial. This is where space and light will move your spirit, and you're awed by nature, by the monumentality of space. You take a lift or an elevator up, and you ended up on the roof. On this roof, you're able to look back and see modern metropolitan Singapore. You see the results of the sacrifice. So the journey and the procession takes you up to the top, and you're connected back to the current success of the city. I thought that a metaphor could also drive design very well. So depending on the type of project, the approach is very different.
Even you said that in public space, you cannot apply the same design language in the residential program, but we could still see it from that the space, light, the waters to reflect the old part of the architecture. We could still see the key icon design elements from your side. And we would like to know that in the Singapore Art Museum, you actually to preserve these old architects and to develop a new one to around it. And we can see it's quite modern and simplicity. And you also be influenced a lot by the classic architecture. So our question would be that in between old and new, and what do you think that you could carry on from the classic architecture and to apply it into the modern times, into the modern design?
Yes, I mean, that's a good observation. Even though the introduction looks like they are very contemporary modern buildings, I'm very aware of the strength that classical architecture can bring to the table. When I was a student, I toured Europe and looked at monuments. I looked at palaces, Asian palaces, Indian palaces. I realized the power of symmetry, the power of exterior courtyards. But most of all, I understood that classical architecture was about procession. It's about designing sequentially, allowing people to go from space to space and be able to choreograph the experience of each part of the journey. That means design thinking about the human body, thinking about the experience of light, space, air. So even though it's an institutional building and the scale is much larger, that lesson of classical architecture, the strength that it brings, the ability to bring emotional response is never lost. It stays within what I design.
So the emotional response is where actually how you define or how you confirm your standing point of to respond to people's emotional, and where is it from? Like you have so many projects going on and you got different inspirations from the surrounding, from your grown up or from your education background.
I think when you are sensitive and you can absorb the environment, you realize that certain types of spaces evoke certain responses, and that certain types of design, for example, will make you more aware of textures or connection to nature. So when you want to design an architecture that is phenomenological, that means an architecture that is able to evoke emotions, you have to think of sight, you have to think of sound, you have to think of smell, textures, and you think of certain aspect of time as well. So in a lot of my design, I bring in elements of water, sometimes darkness, sometimes light, sometimes spaces are small, sometimes spaces are tall. So all those are devices that you can use. Smooth versus rough, nature versus manufacture. So I think it's not one clear answer, but
sure. And you're also talking about that part of your observation is from the temple, from the local culture, and to connecting the project with the local culture. And it's very important to preserve the lifestyle, and culture is part of it. And could you elaborate this part more?
I think there are a couple aspects to this. When you design in a particular place, especially in certain types of projects, cultural projects, or even resort projects, you have to draw upon the essence of each place. When you are doing buildings in city centers, it's harder because it tends to be high-rise. But you have to understand that people experience space differently. For example, in the Western culture, buildings like the Pantheon, the Parthenon, classical buildings are very heavy and inward-looking. In Eastern buildings, the construction could be wood. They could be centered more around courtyards. So again, the feeling is very different. For example, in the Summer Palace in Japan for the king, it's a very modest building. And then you go to the Imperial Palace of Forbidden City. You know, again, you understand that the idea of the concept of hierarchy is important. So it's very important to understand history.
So talking about you actually to responding to the nature or the culture of the city, and we would like to know that in your Kangqiao project, now how you respond to the local culture there and what kind of the spirit you would like to deliver.
I think in that particular project, I was looking at more an expression of spaces that can be used for multi-generational living. And of course, taking on considerations of the site and the view and creating an environment that's very suitable for dwelling. So the cultural element is not as strong. I refer back a bit more to the Chinese culture, but in terms of the architecture, it's still quite universal. So it becomes the argument of, should every building in a different place look like it's from that place?
Yes.
And sometimes you can't do that because today high-rise building depends on technology, depends on certain types of construction method. So while the world is becoming more homogeneous and more universal, we can still hold on to parts of something that's unique to each place through other means, other building types like museums, resorts.
And then would you think that in China, that what kind of the biggest challenge that you would ever met when you apply your practice?
I understand developers' needs, and usually when I start a project, I come up with ideas. But as ideas becomes developed and I work with market forces, I realized that in China, the approach of developers is quite singular. And this is my message to all developers if they're listening, because there's a balance between, for example, organizing a whole building around views, that every unit must have a view, versus composing a scheme around views, but sacrificing a few units to have a very strong concept.
So what would be, what do you think that in China, the future, the tendency or the trends for the project would be, and what the design should be, what part should be emphasizing for the design in China?
The architecture quality in China is so high. The capability of craft and manufacturing is so high because China has the skill to make things. And I think China will come up with its own direction, because right now it's quite universal, but I could see every project that I'm doing, the requirements are getting higher, clients are getting more demanding, and all our partners and consultants have a very high skill. So I'm quite sure that in due course, the kind of work that comes out of China will be unique. It's going into an era that's going to be leading in terms of the design, and they're going to be able to integrate a lot of technology into these buildings. So it's an exciting time for China, I think.
And I'm actually started to pick questions from the audience. So one of the questions is that actually about the Soori Highland projects. When architects or designer become a developer, so how could you unify or to fulfill the design cost and the commercial value in one project?
A good question. To be honest, I'm definitely veering to the side of a designer. It's less of a development. I think in that project, I did go over budget because I wanted to be very clear in what I want to do. And even today, not all units are fully sold. But I think I believe that by being true to the project, and if the project is small enough, like in this case, only 31 units, you can take that risk. It's a boutique project. But if you start to go into 1,000 units, you have to think differently. I do not see a conflict as a designer and developer, because basically I'm a developer so that I can have more flexibility to design. That's why I'm not going to do another development project. That's probably the last one. I realized how difficult development work is and how challenging it can be. To be a developer, you need to have a lot of considerations, ability to understand legal, contract, finance, branding, marketing, project management. I think development is one of the hardest things you can do and the most satisfying thing you can do.
What should be the key factors that you should consider when you're processing urban luxury residential projects?
I think high density projects in some ways are very ecological and sustainable, but it needs strong master planning. It needs the involvement of the city. That's why social housing can work, because when you put a lot of people together in dense areas, you must provide amenities so that within each block you have your own dry cleaners, your own grocery. You can actually eliminate cars. So high density housing is a viable proposal. But of course, today with the global situation and the pandemic, people start to imagine that they want to move away from high density housing because people are concerned about infection rates. People want to move to the suburbs. But I do believe that that is temporary. There are some people that will want to live in the suburbs with the family, and other people that want to live in high density housing. The key to successful high density housing is infrastructure, public transport, all these other factors, and policies, you know, strong governmental policies and healthcare.
So that's become, it's really depending on the policies you could actually to fulfill your design philosophy here in China for the multi-generation space and the modeling, the iconic modeling type to be applied here in China. And now we come to, you keep mentioning about the sustainability, and sustainability is a very nature thing to you and to be emphasized most in all your projects. And you also have said before that architecture itself, meaning that beyond sustainability. So at the occasion of 25th year anniversary of SCDA, and also at this pandemic period, do you ask yourself, yeah, what do you work for, or what do you design for? What actually it bring to you for your design in the future?
I think in some ways, every practice, when you are successful, you build a lot, you tend to get into a situation where you're repeating yourself. And we realize that whatever we have done so far, we need to change. And the pandemic has forced a change because everybody in the world has slowed down and reconsidered what life means, the fragility of life. And I believe this pandemic will allow us to think of it differently with our developers and our collaborators. For SCDA, we're committed to change. We take this opportunity to say we want to change, but we know that changing ourselves is difficult. So we collaborate. For example, we have an agreement now to collaborate with environmental group Bali for the Oceans from New York. They are a very strong group that advocates for ocean conservation and material research. What we don't have at SCDA, we have to collaborate with people. And tomorrow, for example, I have another webinar that's totally different. It's about the intersection of well-being and sustainability. So all these other peripheral aspects indirectly will make us change in our design, but it's going to take time. I don't think it's an issue of pandemic comes, designers get together in a forum and discuss, and within a year or two, they design differently. I think the evolution will be gradual because we're going to have to respond to our clients' needs that are changing. And designers need time to respond to. It's an existential question, larger than a designer could comprehend.
You actually mentioned about your support of the foundation for the ocean preservation, and we would like to know that you have also your hotel to support this fund. And which project actually is the most representative project among all your designs? Would you choose one from it?
Definitely Soori Bali, which I have spoken about, because that project is a different kind of project in a place with actual community. So we're able to do a lot of things there. So our collaboration with Bali for the Oceans really is to help them design an ocean research center in Maldives, in the middle of nowhere. So we have to think about how to be self-sustainable in the island. And we will work with their partners who are scientists and manufacturers. We hope that that lesson learned from that can be applied to the second Ocean Research Center in my hotel in Soori Bali. Soori Bali is a hotel that not only do I design, but I'm running it. And it has programs that are beyond architecture, like wildlife conservation, like turtle conservation, cultural preservation, all these other aspects. So a lot of things that you can do is beyond architecture. It's outside of architecture. Architecture can't solve the world's problems.
And there is a question from our audience. Could you please tell me that SECD's works are almost square boxes with constituents of the space, which is completely different from the surface representative design from Zaha? Is it because of difference in personal style or the square, the volume tricks in people's experience?
Yes, I think there are many approaches to architecture, and over the years, many famous architects have expressed themselves, like Frank Gehry or Kurt Himmelblau or Zaha did. So that's a sculptural approach. My approach of the boxes is not exactly that they are a signature piece that I use. It's just that it's the most efficient, economical baseline of architecture. And a lot of times these boxes are arranged for a reason. The boxes themselves are not important, but the spaces created in between the boxes are more important. So when you have a box and you arrange them in a certain way, you create a courtyard, you create a garden, you create a sense of center. So for me, the void is as important. So by using a rectangular box, you become more generic. The other approach, of course, when you do a memorial or a museum, you can afford to be exuberant, you can afford to be sculptural because it's a standalone building. It's not part of the urban fabric. So it's just a question of different approaches to design. They're all valid.
So, yeah, in design, what's your understanding of home?
Well, I would say home is the most important part of design. If I had to start a young architect in a practice, I say design a house. Because design a house make you understand the rhythm of life. Sleeping, eating, socializing. Starting, for example, with a shopping mall is harder. So I think the idea of home is central to architecture. Ask any young child what home is, and they will draw you a very simple sketch that represents warmth and security and family. So the house is the best design, I still think, no matter what the scale is.
Actually, a last question. It says that as the benchmark work of Kangqiao in 2020, you adopt a minimalist aesthetics and to integrate it into human life. Do you think that beauty and comfort could coexisting at the same time in this work?
I think there are two parts to the answer. One part is about structure and architecture. So when you make structure of beautiful proportions, it actually doesn't need much embellishment. The second part is, what is beauty? Is beauty subjective? But I happen to believe that there's a universal standard of beauty. Some people think beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think universally we can agree when you see something is beautiful. It's beautiful because it's well proportioned and well made. And I think that's what we try to bring into that project. Less important stylistically, but more about the structure of the space.
And she would like to make a summary for our today's discussion. Jessica.
Hi. 特别感谢曾先生的这次分享。为什么想做一个总结？就是其实我们为了这次直播前后进行了2次的排练，然后并且还有就是曾先生为这次的这个直播准备了一个非常非常详细的这个架构，所以我其实要特别感谢他，因为我看到的不仅仅是一个建筑师，他的对设计的创新，他的这个带领团队要做全世界最好的项目。另外呢，我看到了他其实对于一份职业的这种尊重。
Thank you for inviting me.